Absolutely.
I think one of the things about his work that's so encouraging to a writer is that he got a lot better. In other words, there are early stories that are amazing, but one of the gifts he had was the ability to see what worked and what didn't work and to build on what worked. And there are 100 other stories, of course, that aren't in the Red Book that two of the people on stage have read. And you can see him, there were stories that were extremely political that didn't work at all. There were all kinds of mistakes, and you can see him just those mistakes falling away as he goes forward, and the things that were good being developed.
Yeah.
So he, that was one of the gifts he had, was the ability to learn. We were saying this before we all got up here with these microphones, that suburbia, when he started, was not something anybody wanted to write about. And Malcolm Cowley said to him, don't write about suburbia, that's trivial. You have to go to Europe and write about the great things and see the Colosseum. And instead, as things happened, he ended up in suburbia and wrote about suburbia. But looking back, it's clear that suburbia is an amazing metaphor because no one works there. They only live there. So it's incredibly rich and devious and interesting suburbia because it's only about domestic life. The professional life happens somewhere else. And he used that and made it into an unbelievable metaphor, a better metaphor, I think, in a way than the family, for everything that he wanted to say. I just thought it'd be interesting to shift a little and ask Blake to talk about how you go about writing a biography and how it seems to me that for our family, it's been a tremendous blessing to have this biography, and it was a tremendous blessing to have Blake writing it because nobody really cares, what you wore 30 years ago at some party, but your father's biographer cares, right? So, it was sort of like being psychoanalyzed in the best possible way, and I think it'd be very interesting for me to hear a little about how Blake, to what extent he feels he became my father, to what extent you have to. Is it like a marriage? Is it like what's it like writing biography? How do you take this life? And also, your biography doesn't just deal with the life, it also deals, magnificently may I say, with the work. So how do you strike that balance?
First of all, you find a writer whose family is so charming and intelligent in their own right.
Well, no, I thought it was a miraculous book, and as you said, my father got sober, which was like watching someone be reborn, and he came out of rehab, he came out of Smithers, a different person, and he immediately sat down to try to write this novel about the prison, which he had been trying to write before and unable to write. And you could see him going into that, creative vortex that we all know so well. And he was so excited about this book. I mean, he would read to us, he would grab anybody who would listen. And, the scene where the cardinal comes in the helicopter and Jodie escapes, he was just delighted by that. And, read it to anybody who was around. And then I remember at that point, Farragut's name, isn't Farragut behind us? Yeah. Farragut's name was Loomis, and he said to me, I know what happens, Loomis gets out, and he was just taken by this novel, and I think the novel is sort of the apex of his talent. Of course, we all as children read The Count of Monte Cristo, which has a very interestingly similar plot. So like all great writers, he took from his life, he took from literature, he took from everywhere that served him. But I certainly don't think it's an autobiographical novel.
I think any of you can field this question. Do you think John Cheever anticipated his private journals would be public after he died?
Just exactly what you said. I think as he neared the end of his journey, as he would say, he became more and more aware of the immense literary and personal value of the journals. He actually got extremely paranoid about the IRS. He thought that the moment he died, the IRS was going to descend on the house with helicopters, scoop up the journals and say, these are worth millions. The tax on them will be, $700,000, which of course we didn't have. So, in many, many ways, I think he began to understand the value of the journals and to want them published. But as you say, certainly with some ambivalence.
Yeah.
When we went to publish the journals, with, I hope, his complicity, they were edited by the brilliant Robert Gottlieb from this vast pile of documents down to this book. And in a way, the edit reflects Robert Gottlieb. And, the journals are incredibly funny. I mean, my father was the funniest man on earth. He really was funny. And often he was funny at your expense, which maybe made you not so happy about the fact that everyone else in the room was laughing at you. But he was tremendously funny, also at his own expense. And there's a lot of that in the journals, a lot of it. And that just didn't make it into the book. So I hope that someday the entire journal will get published, or at least a representative. In fact, Knopf is supposed to publish it in paperback, but, I think, well, let me answer the cosmic part of the question first. Home Before Dark was written under very weird circumstances. I started writing it when it was clear that he was going to die, after he got diagnosed, and I was supposed to be writing another book, a big novel. And I just thought, what if his stories are lost? Because as I said, he was very funny. He was always telling funny stories. And I thought, well, I'll just write down all his funny stories. And then I'll stop and go back to my novel. And, it just, every morning I would get up and think I should go back to the novel. And instead I would go, but what about the story about Harmon the cat, or whatever it was? And so without knowing what I was doing, I started writing a book. And then when I read the journals, I stopped writing the book because I thought, I am not going to touch this. In other words, my intention was to eulogize him. And actually, let me say, this story that I'm telling now is perfectly presented in the biography for the first time. Anyway, then I had lunch with a Cheever scholar who told me that he was going to write a biography in which he was going to reveal all this stuff. And then someone else. So I became aware that other people were writing about him in an attempt, or partly in an attempt, to sensationalize his sexuality. And I thought, okay, I'm going to write Home Before Dark to protect him. So I wrote it as a eulogy. I wrote it very fast, and it stands up amazingly well to me. But I think what I meant is not that he didn't know what the depths were. It was that he represented them so brilliantly in the surfaces. I mean, sort of what we've been saying all night. And I kind of left the work out. I mean, one of Blake's great accomplishments is to write a biography of a man and brilliant critical essays about the work, and to weave them together. I just didn't really write about the work. I just wrote about the man. And Home Before Dark is a very short, sweet book, and I think it did what I intended it to do.
I think we have to end there. Thank you to our panelists very much, and thank you all for coming.